Hi everyone, I'm Rachael Johns, author of rural romance and women's fiction, and my latest book is The Work Wives, published by HarperCollins. And I am delighted today to be on the convo couch with my good friend and work wife. We have a book club together, which I'm sure we'll tell you a bit more about later. Anthea Hodgson, also author of rural romance and now historical fiction. Anthea Hodgson is a country girl from the wheatbelt in Western Australia. She likes all the usual stuff, from chocolate to puppies and wine and cheese, I'll add. She loves coffee, which probably played a large part in her move from the farm to Perth, although she thinks boarding school may also have had something to do with it. I'm very jealous that you went to boarding school because when I think boarding school, I think of Mallory Towers and Harry Potter, and it just sounds so much fun.
So do I. It was not like that. Don't be jealous.
Okay. I think I've heard from you that it might be. Anyway, in Anthea's previous life, she was child-free. This is before we met. Now we're both very much not child-free, and we spend much of our days, as well as whinging about writing, also whinging about our teenage children. She worked as a radio producer, which I happen to think has to be one of the most coolest previous jobs I've ever heard of. But apparently the coffee was terrible. Wouldn't bother me. But the people were great.
They were great.
As I said, she now has 3 brilliant kids, including her husband. A job she loves even more than radio. Is that true?
Not all the time, but most of the time.
And she's published by Penguin Random House. Her 2 first books were called The Drifter and The Cowgirl, Amazing Rural Romances. And her latest book is The War Wives. The War Nurses. It should be called The War Wives, Anthea.
Maybe the next one, Rach. I'll work on that for the next one.
Yes, that's a good idea.
I'll marry one of them off.
Excellent. Okay, I'm always helpful with sequels and stuff like that. So Anthea's latest book is The War Nurses, published by Penguin, and it comes out in April. And I absolutely love that Kelly Rimmer has given you a quote for this book. Have you got the quote by Kelly Rimmer there? Because I have not in my book.
I do. I was so thrilled. Kelly was so kind. She has written, I could not put this book down even as it broke my heart. So I was thrilled. Yeah, beautiful.
So we all know that I'm quite hard when it comes to reading. So I didn't need tissues, although I did find it very emotional and I absolutely love it. Do you think people need tissues? Should we warn them they need tissues? Your publisher cried, didn't she?
Not necessarily, but yeah, a lot of people have. So yeah, maybe. If you're a lovely softie, maybe. Yeah. Because I don't think my publisher's got through it many times without crying, and she's read it a lot.
Yes, your wonderful publisher is Ali Watts from Penguin, who I think so many people have such respect for in this industry. So we'll maybe talk about your editing process later. But let's take a step back first. And maybe I'll learn some things too, because as I told everyone, Anthea and I are good friends. We do a lot of things, authorly things together. We have been on research trips for my books and future ones of Anthea's. Yes. We also run the Rachael Johns online book club, as I mentioned briefly in the intro. But I think that everyone always has skeletons in their closet. So I'm hoping today that I can find some things out about you that I didn't know, and that all the listeners for Rights of Women will find wonderfully interesting. So I want to know, you started in radio.
Yes.
But let's go even further back than radio.
Yep.
What did you want to do when you were in high school?
Oh, when you're talking about skeletons, I was thinking, gosh, I've really got nothing interesting to add here. And now you're proving it. When I was in high school, I wanted to be a writer for sure. But you know how you have a few things. So I probably had vet because I like animals.
Everyone wants to be a vet at some stage.
Yeah, I had vet.
My son.
Yeah, exactly. Lovely boy. I reckon vet or something in film and TV.
Yep.
But didn't know what, but storytelling-y, that sort of thing. But I didn't.
And so why radio? What did you do at uni? Sorry.
Uni, I did film and TV, English degree type thing.
Okay.
And then because I'm in WA, there was not a lot being filmed here then, and next it's improved a lot, but the industry was in the east. And so radio became the most obvious electronic media thing for me to do. And so then I moved into talk radio and would get up super early in the morning. No, actually, I lie. I did a bit of everything because I did super early in the morning, but most of my initial time was spent late at night working.
Oh, I didn't know that. See, there you go.
Weekends till late at night, which is really tough on talk radio because most people are out and about or are sleeping off the working week. And Then I did, during the week, I was producing Graham Mabry for a while. He was on nights here in Perth. And then I moved to Sydney. And so then worked a little bit in radio, but because we lived way out in Castle Hill, which I think you used to live in Castle Hill.
Oh, I did too, yeah. How hilarious.
I was common. Yeah, because I remember being surprised when I heard you used to live there. I was so far from the station that it just became too hard. And so then I left radio for a while, got back into it in Brisbane. We moved up to Brisbane and I worked commercial there and then started working at the ABC there, which I really loved. And then popped out a couple of babies and we moved back here. And I've never found it easy enough to return to radio because with 2 small kids and my husband works away a lot. And so I just found the hours too punishing to get back into radio.
Yeah. And so you went then back to had you always had that burning passion to write a book? And then you decided that was when to do it?
Yeah. Even when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a writer. It didn't occur to me it was something that you could actually do. Like I think coming from a farming family, pragmatic. And so I think I was aware, that's a nice thing to want to do, but you don't actually do it and no one gets published and all that sort of stuff. And so I don't think I really pursued it. And it was only when I was at home with the 2 kids and I thought something that I could do from home would be really handy. And so then I knew rurals were quite big at that stage. And so I thought I am rural. And if I was going to write anything now, I would have access to that sort of history. That's why I sat down and wrote Drifter when I had the littlies and I got up early while they were asleep and fitted it around the kids.
2 things I want to investigate there. Yes. When you say you are rural, explain what you mean by that to our listeners.
I'm from a tiny little town called Yealering in the WA wheatbelt, and my mother is also a farm girl from Darkin. So we've got 4 or 5 generations of farmers on both sides of my family. So we're all sort of farmers' daughters, farmers' sons. My farm is still there in Yealering. My brother's still on our family farm. And it was my grandfather and great-grandfather who went out and cleared it, which is actually, we'll be talking about that family later, I've ended up writing about. So yeah, we're very much rural people. But I've got to say, I went away, as you said in my bio, I left the farm full-time when I was 12. But I still really love myself. And I still know, because my mum is still mates with all those people. My dad's now died, but my mum is still mates with all those people. And I still know exactly what's going on in everyone from Yealering's life because my mum catches up with all the girls all the time. So once you're rural, you're always plugged in.
Yeah. Did you ever consider farming yourself?
When I was a teenager, I very much did. Yeah, I would have quite happily been a farmer. But I think once I was an older teenager, I was more attracted to the storytelling side of things. So I wanted to get more into either film or TV or writing or radio or something like that. I just wanted to go out and do something more exciting.
And you did.
What?
And you did. What is, not that farming's not exciting because we both write.
Yeah, I miss it. I miss it. Exactly. I do. I miss the countryside and I love, whenever we go on trips, I just love being out amongst the paddocks and seeing what the crops are up to. And yeah, I love the community out there. It's just wonderful. Yes, I do miss that. And I'm sad that my kids haven't grown up in that.
Yeah. Having been in the country too myself and my kids were there from birth to between 7 and 11. Yeah. I sometimes wish they had more time there because it is such a special experience. So let's go back to that first book quickly. We're going to mostly talk about your book, The War Nurses, today, which is a bit of a switch from your first 2 books, which were rural romance. The Drifter. Now, your website tells us that you wrote The Drifter in 5 weeks. Now, I think even pretty speedy writers will agree that is pretty fast to write a novel, especially your first, and especially one that goes on to get published. So how the heck did you manage to do that?
Look, I say it took me 5 weeks to write because it did not take me 5 weeks to get published. So it took me much longer to get published. So yeah, I did. But it was that thing, and I think most mothers are like this, is that you feel like you've got to, it certainly wasn't paying. And you have small children, you have responsibilities. And so you feel guilty for taking time away from doing the stuff that you feel you're supposed to be doing. And to give myself permission to do it, I think I felt like I had to carve out time around the kids. I had to get up super early and I had to get a lot done really quickly. So I think that pressure of not wanting to waste other people's time moved me through it pretty fast. And I'd sat down with my husband and we'd gone, oh, what would be a fun thing, blah, 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 blah. And there was a Jason Statham movie out at the time. I quite like a bit of Jason Statham. And he was a hot homeless guy in London. And so I thought, oh, there's something about that, the Drifter, blah, blah, blah. And so, of course, the Drifter isn't ultimately the Henry character. It's ultimately Kate, my lead. But so I just sketched out this thing and then I just wrote down scenes on cards. I didn't really have an idea of what a structure should be, but I've read so much all my life, I think I knew. And mind you, it still needed a lot of tidying by the time Ali got it. But I wrote it very quickly. I started to send it off. It got roundly ignored. I sent it off to one of the competitions at the RWA, the Romance Writers of Australia, and it didn't even get through the first round. And then
what were those judges thinking?
Yeah, well, did not like it. And then I sent it off, I think the next year, and the same thing happened. And then I thought, that's it, I've just got to go and pitch it. And so I said to my long-suffering husband, I'm too shy to actually go to the conference, but would it be okay if I just went all the way over to Melbourne, pitched my novel, was there for 10 minutes and then left immediately? And he said, that would be fine, darling, how completely normal you are. And so I flew over and did exactly that. I pitched, and that was all I did at the conference. I just flew over, stayed overnight, walked in, pitched, and then flew out. And Ali was lovely.
That's Ali Watts from Penguin?
Ali Watts, yeah. She, funnily enough, we'd already met and she remembered it because she's a big brainy freak. But I met her, I went in and I had memorised my pitch and she said to me, oh, you look very familiar. And I said, we have actually met 15 years ago, but blah. And I gave her my pitch and she was really interested and she really liked the vibe of it. And she's that kind of person. She's a really intuitive reader and very broad thinker about fiction. And so she took it on board and then approached me shortly thereafter and said, look, I'd be interested in doing something with it, but we need to tighten aspects of it. And it's a little slow here and there and all that sort of stuff. And of course, I was thrilled to make whatever changes she wanted. And we went ahead and published.
And it was a brilliant novel. And anyone who can see us, which I don't know, remember if they can see the covers of The Drifter and the Cowgirl behind you now. And I am your friend, so it sounds bizarre when I say, it might sound biased if I say it's a brilliant novel. So I'm just going to put the caveat in that when I read The Drifter, we barely knew each other. We have become very good friends since the Cowgirl, really, where we talked at the online book club that we now do together. And I wanted to say that The Drifter is literally one of the best rural romances I have ever read. It is smart, it is funny, and it's original. It's hard to do it in an original plot in rural romance, but I think you absolutely succeeded with both your books.
Thank you. Yeah, it is hard. Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah, it's a lovely genre of rurals, but it is, as you say, once there's a lot of rurals out there, it is hard to keep it fresh. Yeah.
Yes. And speaking of keeping it fresh, we're going to get into your historical in a second, but is there anything you do when you decide to write a novel, when you come up? I know that you've written 2 rurals and 1 historical that have been published, and I think there's at least 1 book in between there that
that
hasn't happened. Is there anything when you're thinking about writing a novel, when you've got that first seed of the idea, like how do you work out whether that is worth pursuing and whether it is original enough? And is there anything you do to try and work out or make it original?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know that I've written enough to actually have a process though, Rach. I reckon the first one, I was just seat of my pants, this would be a thing. And the second one was bouncing off the first, because in the first one I had a character who was a drifter. She was drifting through life, and thematically she was coming home when she came to the farm and she was finding out what a valuable life was, and that the things that she had thought were old and stodgy and stupid were actually quite valuable and what she needed in her life. So in the second one, I was bouncing from that to another girl who was stuck on the farm and who wanted to have the bravery to leave the farm and to have the adventures that she had never had. And so she was bookending the other character. So thematically, I guess I was approaching that when I started that. I was more thinking, if the theme of the first one was coming home, then the theme of the second is being set free. And so I built up a world that she couldn't leave and had reasons for being afraid to leave, and then set her free at the end of that. So there was that.
The themes are different, yep.
Yes. And then with war nurses, I've had to do almost no work in that area and a lot of work in every other area, because War Nurses is very much based on an actual event. It's not just based on stuff that happened in the war. It's based on a bombing, a massacre, a rape, a murder.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's get to War Nurses now, which is the book we're mostly talking about today because it's being released in April. Can you give us first, I could read the blurb, but I'm sure you can tell us much more beautifully exactly what this book is about, who the characters are, where it's set, or give us the York notes of Spark Notes.
Okay, so look, I'll try. There's no way I'm going to do better than the blurb on the back. This is going to get boring very quickly because I'll get all mixed up. But I'll start off with the actual history. So there's a thing that happened and I need to tell you about it. The thing that happened in the War Nurses, I'm holding it up, and I don't know if anyone can see it, but I know you can. The thing that happened in the War Nurses is in the Pacific War, we had nurses going everywhere. My bunch all went to Singapore. They spent almost a year in Singapore before anything really happened. So the first section of the book is that they go to war, they're playing golf, they're going swimming, they're going to parties, they're going shopping, they're having quite a good time. Then Pearl Harbor happens and the Japanese start to attack, and they come across and they come to the top of the Malayan Peninsula and they come down very quickly. The British did not expect it to happen. Singapore fell in February of 42, and all the nurses were to be evacuated as quickly as possible. And there was a lot of argument about that because the nurses didn't want to leave their patients. And so there are a lot of nurses refusing to leave patients. And then they said, no, we must do the right thing and go with these guys who are going on their ships. Everyone was trying to get out of Singapore because they had thought Singapore would never fall. There were a lot of civilians trying to get out, a lot of Dutch people trying to get out as well, because of course it was the Dutch East Indies at the time around them as well. So everyone was onto ships and out trying to get through the straits. As they were leaving, the majority of ships were bombed by the Japanese. Now, my girls got on a ship called the Vyner Brooke. And I say my girls because I'm taking ownership of them in an unfair fashion. But one of them was my great aunt, Minnie Hodgson, and she was one of the girls who was onto the Vyner Brooke. There were 65 nurses on the Vyner Brooke. They were going through the Bangka Strait. They eventually were hunted down by Japanese planes. They were bombed. 12 of the girls then died in the bombing and subsequently drowned. Of those, the remaining girls, they floated into an island called Bangka Island. Some of those girls came in early onto a beach called Raji Beach, and my aunt was one of those nurses. And the other girls floated and came in later, sometimes further around, sometimes at Raji. And they were taken into the camps in Sumatra. Now, the girls who were taken into the camps in Sumatra, they were moved from camp to camp. And eventually, at the end of the war, they were found. Of those girls, 8 of those girls died of illness, malnutrition, typhoid, etc. And they suffered greatly while they were there, were treated brutally, denied food, denied medicines, that sort of thing. Of the girls that were left on the beach, there were 22 of them. And they were with the soldiers that they were looking after. It was decided they had no other option other than to surrender. And so they went, some soldiers went in to surrender to the Japanese, who came out to collect them. And they took the soldiers around the corner of a headland and murdered them. They bayoneted them mostly, and came back around to the nurses, who knew then at that point that they were to be murdered as well. It's recently come to light that they were raped beforehand, which had been a secret that they had pretty much taken to their grave, but it's become apparent now that those nurses were raped first. And one of the great inspirations for me to write it was actually a wonderful woman, and I don't know if it's worth showing you a photo of her because I know you probably know yourself, but just in case. This wonderful woman here, matron Irene Drummond. She was with the nurses on the beach, and they were all made to hold hands. They didn't make them hold hands, but they chose to hold hands. And just as they were walking into the sea with a machine gun in the sand behind them, had been set up aiming at their backs, Matron Drummond sang out to them all. She said, "Chin up, girls. I'm proud of you and I love you all." And I just thought, what a wonderful thing to say, and in the last moments of their life, to have that wonderful woman show them such love and pride. And so that really inspired me to do something with this story. And so it's taken me a long time to write, but it's also been a story that I've wanted to write ever since I did Drifter. But I just was waiting until I was a good enough writer. And then I realized I'd run out of time. I'm never going to be a good enough writer to write. So I just had to do it. And so then I made the mistake of putting them up on my wall. They're right next to me, right there. And
Perfect.
been sitting there all that time. And so once you put them up, you can't take them down. And so now I've had to commit to writing it. So there was the reason we know this story that I've just told you is because one of them was Vivian Bullwinkle, who
I was going to ask how you knew about it. Yeah.
Yes, and she survived. So she was shot. She fell forward. She managed to pretend she was dead. She later went into the camps, and they kept that secret throughout the war. And at the end of the war, she told the truth about what had happened. But there's someone who came through the camps during the war, and they thought, heck, we're all going to die here anyway of starvation and disease. So they did tell one of the commanders top secret, just in case they didn't make it. But yeah, she made it through, and she went to the Tokyo War Tribunal with that story. So yeah, so that we would never have known what had happened to those girls had she not survived.
So is she the reason that the secret has come out that they were raped?
Oh, kind of indirectly. There's a few stories about it. She had been talking to a journalist who said that she did say to her that something had happened, but that's not been fully verified, I don't believe. And then there was another story where they were in a car and two of the old nurses were there with this journo, and she said that she's been telling her what's happening. And the other lady said, "You haven't told her the other thing, have you?" And she said, "No, I haven't told her that." So we're not sure about that. But her uniform is at the Canberra War Memorial.
Saw it last year myself.
Ah, yes. And looking at that with the entry point and the exit point of the bullets, it looks like she's been stripped, like it's been stripped down from her waist, and because it doesn't line up in terms of where her wound was.
Oh, interesting.
And so it seems extremely likely that it was the case. And also there's evidence that the people that they surrendered to had already raped and murdered nurses in Hong Kong in a Day massacre that happened there. So it seems extremely likely that is what happened to them. Yeah.
Now, we obviously don't want to give away. I was going to ask you another question. I thought maybe that's a bit of a spoiler about Vivian, because it is a story based on fact, but you have fictionalized it to make
I have embroidered.
Yeah,
I have embroidered here, and there've been things that there's so much that I've left out. It pains me to say, but
sequel.
That was the other challenge about it though, Rach, because I'm trying to write a story that is a history, but I'm aware that my readership are not history fans necessarily. I don't want it to be a stuff happening in order book. I want it to be a fiction that pulls in the general reader and gets you right into the heart of these nurses and shows you what they went through and how it felt. And so some of all of my characters really are fictional, even though I would say Vivian's not, but I've kept her at arm's length because I haven't wanted to turn her into a major character and then pretend she said stuff she didn't. I've used my aunt's name. I have altered one or two little things about her past. I put some family history in there that's true, but I have altered a few things just so it's not a biography.
So for those people who will have read it by now, who are going to read it, tell us the facts about your Aunt Minnie. Like, what have you kept that's real about Aunt Minnie, and what did you pick?
Yeah, sure. Look, Aunt Minnie, she did go to boarding school, and in the novel, she runs away from school. She gets a report that says unsatisfactory, and she's not happy with that. And she runs away from school when she's about 14, 15, we reckon. And the family at home in Yealering didn't know until she just walked up the front drive. Like, no, school didn't mention it. She didn't mention it. She just arrived home and stayed home for a little while, and then declined to go back to that school and went to another boarding school to finish off her high school years. So she went to 2 boarding schools down here in Perth. So that part was true. There was also, I refer to the drowning death of, I've called him her twin. He was not her twin. Her brother, Oliver. The family called him Noel, but I call him Oliver in the book. But he drowned in the Swan River. He was down here at school and he was part of the rowing team. And he reached out in the boat, and he reached out for an oar that was floating away, fell in and drowned. And his death is in the book as well. She also, another thing that I included about her was she was quite interested in a lovely farmer from Coolin, she was a matron at Condinin, which I've included, and she was quite interested in a farmer from Coolin. He, though, was interested in someone else, and she realised it was not going to work out, and that's when she joined the army. So there are some truths about Auntie Minnie in there, but yeah.
So it's the guy's fault, because if she'd married him, she never would have died.
I reckon if she had married
eventually
him,
she would have died, but
yeah, she would have died by now. But I think if she'd had her way, she probably would have married him, left nursing, because that would have been what you do, and she probably would have been a farmer's wife out at Coolin. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. It's an amazing story of all the girls that you've fictionalized, and I know you've taken so much, having been there with you for the last 3 or 4 years, that you have been researching and writing this story. No, it has been fascinating. The only frustrating thing is, listeners, that Anthea wouldn't let me read it until it was in advanced reading format beginning to end of last year. And as soon as it arrived, I feel very connected to this story. Even though I didn't write it, I feel like I almost did.
Yeah, you and Fiona Palmer, as I was walking around the paddock on our morning walks and walks and talks, and I've been telling you, oh, this has got to go in and that's got to go in and this is coming out. And the other thing being, of course, that what I wanted to happen in the fictional part of the story, because my fictional characters, they do get on the Queen Mary and they do travel and all that's as it happened. But I do have my fictional characters living their lives within that. But the songs that they sing and all that sort of stuff, that's pretty much true. I think I snuck one song in that they didn't sing.
Yeah.
But all that sort of stuff's true. But then I had inconvenient things happen. The year that they're there in Singapore, the Japanese haven't attacked them. And it quite suited me if my hero would have a horrible injury from fighting. And then I found it very inconvenient that they hadn't attacked yet. So I had to find a way to injure him. Or
let's not say what you did.
No.
We don't want to give too much away. But that is interesting, isn't it? The process of writing books and how often you think you're going to be able to do something, but then for various reasons, we have a debate occasionally about, you've written now contemporary and historical fiction. Yeah. I like ribbing you and anyone who's written historical fiction, because people who've written historical fiction, I tend to hear them think it's very hard. So they put a lot of effort into the research. It has to be exactly right, and it's much harder than writing contemporary story. And I have to say, I think that's a lot of bollocks, because as I have been known to say at events and things before, in historical fiction, you've got things like horrific illnesses that will actually kill people off. You've got wars more than we do in the contemporary world that we write about today, although I do know there are wars. But you've got medical, sorry, we talked about medical already. If you have a baby outside of marriage, shock, horror. If one of your girls gets, if one of them got pregnant, while she was there, that's terrible. You're not allowed to be gay or anything like that. So there's so many things. You don't have Facebook, you don't have mobile phones that can
something or
Google. So I feel like that as contemporary writers have a lot more tricky than historical fiction authors. But you've written both. So I would like you to tell me the differences between writing your rurals and writing your historical fiction. Did you prefer one or the other? Just give us a general sort of.
The reason I'm going to say I very much prefer writing rurals, because when I was digging around going, oh, for goodness sake, because even things like, I wrote my thing and I'm not an historian. I'm interested in this story, but I'm not a historian. And so I'd written things like, oh, and blooming Jeeps, blah, blah, blah. And then my husband reads it and goes, Jeeps, the Japanese wouldn't have used Jeeps. That's an American thing.
Lucky he knew.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And so by the time I was getting down to that sort of thing, going, oh, this is getting really annoying now, I was feeling a bit over it by then. I would say, I reckon, I do love history. I'm a bit of a history boy. I do love writing historicals, and I've loved and hated writing this. But I do say I love writing a historical, except that writing about an event is hard, because I think if you're writing something set during an event or during a
you're fictionalizing it completely, you mean?
Yeah. If you're setting something it's set in the court of King Henry VIII, fine. You can have a lot of things happening that who make it up, whatever. But once it's stuff that happened that people have families involved in and stuff, just the weight of responsibility of getting stuff right. And there'll be stuff in here that's right. And there'll be stuff that I've deliberately fudged, actually, because some of it you go, that gets repetitious if that's going to happen 10 times. So I've got to squeeze stuff and I've got to cut stuff out. I've got to keep this thing moving. So I would say, I'm going to say it's easier to write a rural. That said, I've only done it twice. I don't think it's easier if you do it any more times than twice.
Nothing's easy really in the writing world, let's face it. But how did you, I had a question then about how did you decide what to put in the book? Because you did a lot of research.
It's so painful.
Tell us some of the anecdotes that you found that you just loved about the story that didn't make it in.
Oh, look, I probably have brain dumped them now because it's so upsetting to lose them. There were lots of things that I really wanted in. There was one or two. Once I was at your event and I was talking to someone about a story that I liked, and I realised that it had gone. And I went, when did that go? I haven't seen it recently. And I remember emailing Ali on the bus saying, that's got to go back in. It was my spitting story, which I really liked. But look, there was a lot of stuff that couldn't go in. There was stuff that I loved, but slowed down the story. So I've got this whole fiction. I've got my 4 fictional characters, which I haven't even told you about yet, which is Minnie, my fictional Minnie, who is the real Minnie, but fictional Minnie. Then I've got Margot McNee, she's the eyes through which we see the whole drama. She is the witness to it all, is my Margot McNee. She starts off as a very timid sort of nurse. She's very rules-driven, very timid. Then I have Beth, who is just dead set cracker.
I loved Beth. She's probably my favourite. She's from Queensland and just a cracker, isn't she?
Yeah,
such a character.
Yeah, loved her. So she was based on a nurse called Blanche Hampstead. Real name was Pauline, but she's called Blanche Hampstead. And she was totally fantastic and hilarious. And so I loved her. But she comes in and she's couldn't kill me with an axe kind of girl. And she's there looking after people, drinking, smoking, not giving a toss. She's fantastic. So I had her. And then I had Lola, who was from Sydney. She has a very sad thing in her past. She's quite idealistic and almost like a Disney princessy nurse. She loves to sing. She yearns to fall in love and to be loved by someone. And Lola, she's got a sad past, and that's what makes her so idealistic. So I had those girls, and I needed, and this is where Ali Watts comes into her own, because when I sent it to Ali, what I had, and how long ago I was stomping around in this mess, and I eventually just sent it to Ali and said, I don't even know if this is a thing or if I just need to move on with my life. Could you just have a look? Because I trust Ali to tell me what's what. And Ali really loved it and said, look, it's definitely a thing. She signed it on the spot, and then she had faith in me to fix it, because then we had to go back and fix it. And what we needed was those 4 characters. I'd been wanting to get on with the action because I'm desperate not to bore my audience, and I'm aware that it's an historical and it's based on a real thing, and I can feel it feeling stodgy to people who don't care. And so I really want to get in there. And she said, no, slow it down. I want to know who they are. And so Ali really helped me shape the start of the novel again, and where there's more of them on the ship, which the Queen Mary had been commissioned for wartime use. And then more of them in Singapore, and some of the shenanigans. There's a love story that happens. There's some adventures that happen, and all their characters come out and all their relationships form there. And then the tension ratchets up with the arrival of the Japanese coming down the peninsula. And then the tension ratchets up when they have to get onto those ships. And then when they're on the Vyner Brooke and they're being hunted, the tension ratchets up, and then of course they're in the sea, bombed in the sea.
Yeah, I was just going to say, isn't it interesting as writers? I think especially these days, when there's so much distractions of social media and Netflix, and we can always be busy doing podcasts and all this sort of stuff. It's so different to the days of Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, where take your time to get into a novel. And now we're always told you must start the action immediately. Don't dump us on backstory and info dumping and all this sort of stuff. So I found it fascinating that we're paranoid about that, but Ali's main editorial to start with was to really show us character, which goes down to what I definitely believe, that you can have a great plot, which obviously you do because it's something that's happened and there's a lot of action in it, there's a lot of heartbreak and stuff. But to make the readers care, you had to make those characters people that we would care about.
Yeah.
So how did you distinguish them, and how did you decide, what did you do to make the readers care? And have you got any advice for aspiring authors or other authors in how to make their characters pick ones that people actually give a damn about?
I think backstory is really important. I think humour is really important.
Which you do very well, always.
Yeah,
even Anthea's text messages people.
I do love a bit of a laugh. And so I think humour is important, because I think people automatically start relating to people. Once you're laughing, you're already on the same wavelength. So I think humour is important. And backstory, I think, is really important. But you can't just lump it out there. So I just think slowly discovering backstory. And I think details are important.
I agree.
Just those little things or that little mannerisms that you see in people, and I think you absorb them without even knowing that they're there, but they add to this impression, and then you feel as if it's a real person that you know. People like Beth was great because she she's quite a mannish sort of character. And so she was always sort of beer drinking, smoking. So every time she would make some sort of comment about that, you'd go, oh, that's definitely Beth. Even if it was in a dark room, you go, oh, that's Beth.
Yeah.
And she, there's even a scene of her where she rolls up pages of the Bible and smokes them like cigarettes while she's chopping wood in the camp and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of that stuff is just based on the real story of the nurses. And you actually were asking me before about stuff that had to go. And a lot of the stuff, there were tons of little stories from the camp. And my problem is it's such an unbalanced story because time-wise, the camps are like 3 or 4 years because they were in 42, so say 3 years, finish 45. And you can't have everything that happened in the camps because it's going to be the longest, most boring thing ever. But there were so many charming, amazing stories of them being funny or brave or dress-ups, or this one nurse who had wore glasses and the guard was about to slap her face. And the other nurses were very amused because she held up her hand to say stop. And then she took her glasses off and he slapped her. And then there was another Dutch lady who liked to wear really bright lipstick, and one of the guards, because they nicknamed them all, and this one was called Lipstick Larry, so he obviously didn't like lipstick. And so he came and he tried to slap her face and she ducked, and they were at Tenko, which was the counting, and the whole camp was wondering what's going to happen. So he had another go and she ducked again. And then she took off around the corner and he took off after her and never found her. And so everyone, those small little victories, everyone would take great strength from. And that reminds me of the spitting story that accidentally got cut out, which I had shoved back in, which was right near the end. They're in the final camp and they've moved from camp to camp. They're all dying. They've moved them to a new camp to try and slow the deaths from malaria, etc. And the nurses not only have the Japanese positioned their quarters and their latrines over the river from which the nurses are carting their water, so they potentially are drinking their toilet waste. The nurses are carting their water for the Japanese guards, but they had a rule that you had to have a little layer of foam on the top, which meant that you'd been spitting in their water enough on the way back up to make sure that they were drinking your spit. So they had all that sort of stuff, and they never lost their courage. And if they ever had anything, they would share it with each other, be it a cardigan was left to one of the nurses and she sold it for some food for one of the other nurses who was dying. And if they ever had a quinine tablet, they'd save it for someone who was more ill than them. They always worked for each other. Yeah, amazing, amazing women.
I think that's the wonderful thing about this story. If you gave a quick premise of it, it could sound like might sound like a very depressing part of our history, that it would be a really hard read. But the most important, I think, for me reading this book, yes, I was very fascinated to learn about a part of our history that I had no idea about. Shame on me. But the most magical part of the book was the relationships between the women and the nurses. Yes, they were really brave people, but it was, even in the absolute depth of despair, they could laugh, they looked out for each other. And I think it's just a wonderful story of female friendship, right? And it's a triumph for that. You mentioned, so obviously all these little stories, you must have done so much research. So we have, I think, the 3 parts of writing a book, especially one like this book, and that's the research of the pre-writing kind of stage, and then the actual writing, and then the editing, which you've also touched on a little bit about.
Yeah.
What do you think what stage took the longest in this book? Was it the research, the writing, or the editing?
Oh, the rolling my eyes and hating my life took the longest. Look, I reckon, oh God, who knows? The writing took forever. I've got to say, research took forever as well. I
think in the end, you probably edited it pretty quickly, actually.
Compared to the rest of it.
Yeah.
Probably. Yeah, I mean,
and maybe that's because then you had Ali's direction and also the confidence that it was going somewhere.
Yeah, it was the thing by then. I think I felt obliged to get it back quick smart. But yeah, I'd say the writing and rewriting took the longest. Because the other thing being, Rach, I didn't know how I was going to tell it because I have all nurses. They're all white. They're all vaguely middle class.
Yeah.
They're all doing the same job. They're all in the same situation. And it's really hard. So, like, if I was writing a book with a male plumber who's 50 and a young girl who's a teacher and she's 20, it's her first job, and then a teenager, that's fine. You can tell the difference between them. They live in a different house and everything. But all my people lived together, worked together, wore the same clothes, blah, 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 blah. And so I started off trying to tell it through 4 people. Like my 4 mains, too confusing, and just there was not enough action for everyone. And why was I skipping between all these people? It was painful. Then I went back and just tried to tell it through 1 person. And then I went, if I tell it through 1 person, what am I going to do when Minnie's off on Roger
doing this or whatever? Yeah.
But then I had to do had to do two. So it's ended up being through Margot and Minnie. But even that was difficult because then when I went back through and I was redividing, the history then had to be realigned so that it happened in order, because by the time I was pulling out story arc and character arc, it was then bouncing into the wrong bit of history. So then I had to re-separate out everyone's character arc and put them back in order to follow the history of what happened. So the whole thing, it was just a big disaster.
You've managed to pull it off. So the whole, like, we're probably going to wrap up in a moment. I've got a few more questions, but let's just touch on character arc there for a moment, because I think that's probably the difference between a factual recount of a non-fiction recount of what happened. You don't necessarily have to have a story and character arc for each person. You're just literally telling the facts about what happened, maybe including some fun anecdotes and stuff, but you don't need to. But you mentioned that, you needed a character arc. Once you'd chosen those two people, how did you decide on what their character arc would be? And can you tell us a little bit about the writing of their character arcs and what you learned about character arc in that?
Yeah, it was such a big deal for me, the character arc, because that is what makes it a fiction and what makes it a general fiction, like an entertaining commercial fiction. Because as you say, if I'm just going to write what happened in order, that's a history and that's nice, and that's not for most people. So I needed my fictional characters to actually have a thing. So I had Margot, who's at the start of the book. I better not go too much into character arc.
So don't give us spoilers.
No, I won't do spoilers. But Margot starts off as a very timid, rule-based person, and quite often they say about the Japanese during the novel, they say they don't play cricket, they don't follow the rules, and that was the truth of it, and everyone was shocked by that. But she's then thrown into this situation, no one follows the rule. So that's part of her arc. Then I have Minnie. Obviously, Minnie's arc in particular, it's happened. She's got an arc that's going to arc, and so with her.
What and you mean by that? Because it's not a spoiler, because you've told us that she dies.
She's going to die.
Reggie
We
Beach.
will know she's going to die.
So you knew that from the beginning.
And that's the thing. None of my characters they weren't going to escape. No one did. They weren't going to fly away in a plane, or they weren't going to fall in love with the Japanese gardens and settle in Japan. Like, they're all set in stone. What has happened to those girls has happened to those girls. And so I had to work within that. So Minnie's arc is more to do with storytelling and going home, and her brother Oliver and beautiful matron Drummond. So she's got her own thing going on. Then I have Lola, who is afraid that she'll never be loved. And she's got she loves musicals, she loves singing, she loves the idea of romance and being loved. And she has her own arc within that. And then I've got...
Even though she's not a point of view character, you're saying?
Yeah, even though she's not a point of view, she has her arc. And then I've got Beth, who's my old mate, and she's the same. She starts off wanting a gun, and she's there for revenge because she lost a friend in the war, and she says, "Give me a bloody gun." And then she has her own arc, and she has another reason, because she decides she's there for another reason. So yeah, they all within that all have their own arc. Yeah.
And so that I think it was very well done, and obviously it took you a while to work that out, didn't it?
Yeah, I had to find that. Yeah, I had to find it, or the book would have been a bit thin without it. And the idea of it is to make you care about those nurses. And it's, for most people, oh, that's very interesting, but I needed to try and make people care.
So this may kind of answer my next and second last question, which is a kind of a two-parter. I wanted to give you, if you could give us some advice, and I want two specific bits of advice for aspiring writers or writers looking to change genre. The first is for aspiring authors. You wrote Drifter after many years of wanting to write a book. You said that it was beginning to do something while you had young children or whatever. A lot of people I hear, and I'm sure you've had people ask similar questions, is, I'd like to write a book, but I don't know where to start. So what's your advice on where to start if you want to write a book?
I was hoping you were going to say, I can't find the time, because then I would just say, get up early. I don't know where to start. I reckon, and I think I've heard you say this actually, so I'm possibly stealing it, but I reckon, because there's the old write what, and I did that a little bit with Drifter, because I knew about my hometown. But what I think is more important is write what interests you, write what you're curious about. And I think the most interesting people that you hang out with are curious people who notice things and who comment on things and who wonder about things. And so I think to write about what you're interested in, because it's blooming hard work and it's going to take a long time. So you may as well be interested in it. So I think if you can find a topic that interests you, even if it's within romance or whatever genre. If you can find an angle into that is of interest to you, then I think that would pull you through. But also, I think you've got to find a character you love, and you've got to really know and develop that character, because I think there's nothing slower and more dragging and plodding than reading a book where I don't feel the central character. And if I'm not rooting for that character and feel like I know them and can relate to them, don't have to like them, but if I can't relate to them and they don't feel rounded. So I think probably an interesting topic to you and a really strong central character. I would work on those.
Great advice. And I feel like maybe that character was what got you through the writing of the war nurses in the end, because there was the nurses initially inspired you, but then you made them your own characters, and you could not have been story.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't have been more invested in these characters. Yeah.
Okay. The second part of the writing question is, any advice for people wanting to write fact-based historical fiction?
Don't do it.
Don't do it. Okay, fair enough. That's a good piece of advice. Is that it?
It depends on how fact-based you are. There's some things that are inspired by, and I would go down that route any day of the week now. Inspired by all the way for me, I think. But if you love history and if you love research in history, get into it. The only thing I would say is, and I've found this a lot with this book, is there's a lot of different versions of a lot of the stories, and a few, like even one of my little boys, one of my little characters I was talking to about today, not with you, I was probably telling Possum, she's asleep down here. Misha the bear was a little Jewish boy, and he loses both, his real boy, and he loses both his parents early on in their imprisonment. His father drowns and his mother dies. And in one of my books, I'm holding up, I don't think you can see me, but anyway, in one of these books, he's referred to as being Russian. And so I started off calling him Russian, and then I picked up another book.
Oh no!
Which referred to him as being Polish.
Oh dear!
Or being from Poland, and I went, and so then I swapped back to Poland. And then I went, oh no, Misha, and so I have him saying that his father's Russian, because I thought, I don't know, I can't sort you out, Misha, so I'm just going to say your dad's Russian. So in there, when you see. That's him. So
I love it.
So if you're trying to be too close to and I'm just going to say it's fiction, but if you're trying to be too close, I think it can suck some of the fun out of it, because I think you can get the creative aspect of fiction writing is why I'm here. And I want it to be entertaining, and I want you to bloody know about these nurses, and I want you to care. But if I'm going to get so bogged down in the minutiae, it's not going to be entertaining. So at some point, you've got to let it.
Awesome advice. Okay, final question.
Okay.
That I already know slightly the answer to, but so you've written a rural romance.
Yes, I have.
You've written actually a screenplay, but we haven't even gone on to that. That's a whole other thing. You've written rural romance, you've written a screenplay, and you have written historical fiction, and historical, I should say. What is next for Anthea Hodgson? What are you going to work on?
Thank you for asking. When we say what's next, we're not talking next week.
What I mean is, because did you feel you can tell us about what you're actually thinking about, but did you ever, that's a book to just give us an example, a sneak peek. Was this a delve into historical fiction, and now you're going to be a historical fiction writer from now on? How did you decide what to write next, and then what are you writing next?
Look, I'm hopefully writing next. Here's even, talking to the dead. Why would I not be writing that? I'm staying historical for a while because I am historical. I'm finding I'm very interested in historical. I'm not great at romance, let's face it, but I
wouldn't say that.
Do like banging, and not as good as you, lady. I need to get you to write my rude scenes for me.
But that's okay, because Anthea writes my description for me, so I think it's fair enough.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So look, I'm going to stay historical for a while. And you and I did a road trip out to Kalgoorlie a year ago now, actually. I think it was March we went out.
Oh, yeah.
And it was fantastic. And there's a lot of things, so many stories. It's a gold mining town. There's gold rush. There's prostitution out there, which was a system they only had in Kalgoorlie, as far as I know, called containment, where the sex workers were contained to one street. And that system ran through from about 1900 to 1990. And so I really wanted to write, because it's a women's story, I really want to write about sex workers in Kalgoorlie, probably dual timelines, so it'll probably be in the 90s when it's coming to an end and when it's beginning in Cal. Fascinating stories about so much international stuff. So many miners were international, so many of the sex workers are international. So that's all interesting. Also, here's another one. Also, there was a lot of seancing going on around that era, and I'm very interested in putting that in because I want some fun, having been with the nurses for so long. I want some fun. So it's going to be gold, sex workers, seance. Does that sound like
amazing? It does sound like a good read, but I've just realised what you were saying there. You've done rural, done historical, and now you're going to combine a rural, because it's a rural town contemporary, with historical.
And there's going to be a lot of sex scenes I need you to help me with.
Because I've got a lot of description that I need you to help me with in my next book. So it's fair. I look forward to hearing next time we officially chat after you've finished writing this book about the pros and cons of writing dual timeline and how you work that out. Because I think you're a sucker for punishment.
I'm going to say, I can hear now as you say that. I keep doing silly things. And then my next
changing genres.
What an idiot. Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Because there's going to be a different process to learn, and there's going to be different problems, but different joys. So anyway, thank you so much for this delightful chat. I will happily chat to you any day, all day. We didn't even have wine and cheese today, so that is a miracle. Might be a first.
I was going to say, didn't even have a wine this time, which is a bit disappointing. But next time we see each other, we'll have to do. Thank you so much for chatting to me about my new book. I am super proud of it. But as you should be.
So everyone who's listening, get into The War Nurses, which is out April 12th. Is that right?
That's correct.
In Australia and New Zealand. And then you'll know all the little things that we're referring to. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Rights for Women. I hope you've enjoyed my chat with this week's guest. If you did, I'd love it if you could add a quick rating or review wherever you get your podcasts so others can more easily find the episodes. Don't forget to check out the backlist on the Rights for Women website. So much great writing advice in the library there. And you can also find the transcript of today's chat on the website too. You can find details on the website on how to support the podcast through Patreon and get exclusive access to the extended audio and video of the monthly craft episode. And you can connect with me through the website at rightsforwomen.com, on Instagram and Twitter at W4W Podcast, the Facebook page Rights for Women. Find me and my writing at pamelacook.com.au. Have a great week, and remember, every word you write, you're one word closer to typing the end.